Hello everyone! Today is going to be a very exciting day because I'm going to show you how to build the email validation API. So I've built one for myself. I've deployed it to production just over a month ago and it's already generating over 200 euros of monthly recurring revenue for myself. If you want to know how to deploy one of these email validation APIs and host it on the API marketplace for yourself, stick around. Right, so I have my terminal here open. And so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to clone a boilerplate Express application where I've already set up Express to work with TypeScript, okay? So the setup is not that interesting. So what we're going to do is we're just gonna clone it and then we will run through how everything works, okay? Okay, so now if you go into this project, you can obviously change the folder name. And first we need to do npm install to install all of the project dependencies, and now we will open up our code editor in this directory. Okay, so what do we see in our project? We see obviously a package.json which has Express, and just Express. This is a very, very bare bones application with all of the dependencies we need to run TypeScript on our project. And then we have our tsconfig here, and then inside of our source we have our server file, right? So right now we are just exposing one endpoint, a get endpoint, where we return in a JSON format, hello world. So as part of our initial project setup, we're going to try to structure the project in such a way that it's a bit easier to maintain. So what we're going to do is we're going to create 3 folders. Okay, the first one is going to be controllers. The second one is going to be services. And the final one is going to be routes. Okay, so as you can imagine, in routes, we're going to store the routes of our endpoints, which will point, the specific path to a controller inside of the controllers folder. And the controllers will make use of different services that we will program to, for example, validate those email addresses. Right, so with that out of the way, with our initial setup out of the way, what we're going to do is first we're going to understand what are we going to be automating in this API. So I'm back in my terminal, and here we're going to see exactly how are we going to be resolving email addresses and checking whether or not the email address really exists, right? So first of all, we're going to practice doing what we're going to do in the code, but manually, and then we're going to just simply automate it using Node, okay? So how do email addresses work? Whenever you're sending out an email address to, for example, michael@gmail.com, the email service that's sending out this email first needs to check what domain is that email inbox on. So this would be everything that's after the @ sign. So in this case, gmail.com. And the first thing that it needs to do is it needs to, find the SMTP host name for that, right? So one thing is the domain name, where you basically store a mapping of, the domain name itself and to which websites it may point to, right? So this would be when you're browsing with your web browser. The domain name points the domain name to a server and specifically to an IP address of that server. But domain names also store a bunch of other useful information, and some of that information is to do with email servers on that domain name, right? So what we need to do to resolve the host name of an email server on this domain name is we need to look up what's called the MX records inside of the DNS records for gmail.com. Okay, so here I've opened up a website called whatsmydns.net, and this website is a handy tool for us to be able to manually inspect what records are behind a domain name, right? So we can here inspect for A records, CAA, CNAMEs, and we're interested in MX records, right? So here I'm going to type gmail.com, hit search, and we can see that it resolves a bunch of different host names, right? So target is what we're interested in, right? Another name for target would be host name. And then we also have to look at the priority, because the way SMTP works is, or at least the way the MX records work in terms of SMTP is for every, so at least when you search for MX records, you can either, have no records at all, which would mean that there is no SMTP or email server behind that domain name, which means that that email address is not valid, right? That can guarantee that the email address is not valid. But when you find records, there can be one or more. And this is for redundancy reasons, right? So should one of these host names go offline for whatever reason, then you have alternative host names to try. And the way you want to try them is in order of the least priority to the most priorities, right? So it's a bit the other way around, but you want to try out the one with the lesser priority first and then move your way upwards, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this one here. And I'm going to use this one to evaluate for different inboxes in gmail.com, right? In their SMTP hostname here. So this is step one that we have to do. We have to resolve the MX records behind the Gmail domain name. And then step two is going to be to use the SMTP protocol to actually evaluate whether or not, and communicate with the email server to see whether or not that email inbox actually lives inside of that email server. So this is what we're going to do next. Right, so I'm back in my terminal, and in order to communicate through SMTP with the hostname that I just copied, I'm going to use a tool on Mac which is called Netcat. Linux also has this tool, so you can use the same command. If you're on Windows, you have to use a tool that's called Telnet, T-E-L-N-E-T, right? So make sure you search for, if you don't know how to use Telnet, make sure you Google on how to connect to a hostname over SMTP using Telnet, but I guess the commands are going to be very, very similar. Instead of typing NC, you're going to have to type Telnet. NC stands for Netcat in my case. I'm just going to say NC. I'm going to paste in the hostname without that last period that was copied over. And then I'm going to say I want to connect over port 25, right? So NC, the hostname, space 25. I'm telling it to connect to this hostname over port 25, because port 25 is the default port that any email server uses for SMTP protocol. Okay, so I'm inside. Google said, responded with a correct response code of 220. And now I can interactively send commands, because this is an open connection that I've created between my computer and the SMTP server for gmail.com. And now I can just interactively, using this open connection, send commands to this. So the first command that I need to send actually is a EHLO. So this stands for extended hello. And this is basically to tell Google who is attempting to communicate to it, right? So I'm going to say mail.example.org. I can just say any kind of host name. And it basically responds as Gmail at your service here. So this is great. Now the next thing we can say is we're trying to tell Gmail who are they going to be receiving email from. Now this is just to tell Gmail who's communicating to them, which inbox on example.org is communicating to them, but we won't actually be sending email, right? So from : and then we have to say, for example, name at example.org, right? And it says okay. So we've basically said, okay, I am name at example.org, and now we need to say, who am I sending this email, this fake email, or this dummy? It's not even a dummy email, it's a fake email. I'm not even actually going to be sending it. Who am I attempting to send this email to? So in order to do that, we say rcpt2. So this would be recipient 2. Sorry, there's no space here, right? So make sure you don't add that space. And I'm going to say foobar@gmail.com. So this is the email that we're trying to check, okay? And basically it responds with 250, which is okay. So we know that this email inbox exists, okay? The last command we can say is quit, okay? So this would basically close the connection. So like this, we have used the SMTP protocol to actually validate an email inbox on Gmail, right? Let's try this again with another email, right? So I'm going to say ehlo mail.example.org, okay? Mail from name at example.org, gmail.org, rcpt2, and now I'm going to say, let's say michael@gmail.com, and then it says the email account that you're trying to reach does not exist. Please try double checking your receipt link's email, blah, 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 right? So this would be a case where Gmail basically responds that this email inbox doesn't exist, right? So this is how we're going to be, I'm going to send quit again. This is how we are going to use the SMTP protocol to verify email addresses, okay? So now the next step that we're going to do is we're going to automate this in Node.js. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to import body parser, because I want this to be a post request instead of get request. And whenever you're working with JSON post requests in Express, you need to import something that's called a body parser, because it will basically make your life easier when parsing post JSON formats, okay? So I'm going to say npm install --save body parser. Okay, I have that now here, so I'm going to import it, import body parser from body parser. Okay, I'm gonna delete that because we're not going to be writing our controller here. We're going to be writing our controller inside of the controllers folder. But instead here, I need to say app.use, and here I'm gonna say body parser.json, which is basically adding the body parser middleware for it to parse JSON post request for us in such a way that it's just gonna make our life much easier, okay? Okay, so with that out of the way, I'm going to create a new TypeScript file inside of controllers. I'm going to say validate email controller. And I'm going to say, I'm just immediately going to export a function called validate email controller, okay? Actually, I'm not going to call it controller because the file is already called that, right? Right, so now we're exporting a function, and this will need to be an async function. And so now in routes, we need to direct a route to this controller, which is for now empty. So I'm going to create a new TypeScript file instead of routes and say validate email.routes. And here we're going to be importing router from Express, and we are going to be importing our controller. Okay, the next thing we need to do is we actually need to create a router. So validate email routes is going to be equal to router. Then validate routes post, and this is where we're going to be making use of that body parser, will redirect everything to validate email. Okay, so basically whenever you hit the root endpoint on a post request, we're going to be sending everything to validate email. And the last thing we just need to do is export validate email routes. Okay, and now to tie everything together, we need to go to server and basically implement this here. And the way we do this is super simple, is app.use validate email routes. Okay, so this is already imported for us, and now we can get rid of these imports, which we will be using instead in the controller. Okay, so our server file looks good. Now we need to add the request, response, and next for Express. And here is where we can import these from Express. Okay, so we're gonna say import request, response, next function. Okay, now we need, since this is TypeScript, we need to strictly type this function signature, right? So rec is going to be a request, response is going to res is going to be response, and next is going to be of type next function. Okay, so now everything is working correctly. And so basically the first thing that we want to do is we want to check if email is actually present in the body, right? So we're going to say if not, request body email. So this is basically a way of, instead of writing 2 if statements, we're going to be writing 1, right? Because in modern JavaScript or TypeScript, what you can do is you can access something inside of an object without knowing if the object is actually undefined. because if you add this question mark, it's first going to evaluate if request body is undefined. And if it is, then this is anyway going to be false. So if not true is false, right? But if this does exist, then it's going to go ahead and evaluate email inside of this, right? So this is how we can avoid writing two if statements in just one. So in either case, even if body was empty because the user didn't send us a body in the request, we would still probably return the same error message, right? Saying error missing email because the email is, missing, right? And then what we do is we just return the next function because we don't want the next piece of code to be evaluating. Okay, so now the next step is to validate the format of this email. So we're going to be writing our first function inside of the services folder. We're going to call it verify email format. We're going to export it. Okay. And this function is going to be very, very simple. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be accepting an email address, which is of type string. And we've created a regular expression, which is very, very simple. This is by no means accurate regular expression to test for every single combination of possible email addresses. But instead what we want is we want to make sure that whatever the user is sending us, it roughly looks like an email address. And that's going to be fine because the rest of the work is going to be done anyway by our connection to the SMTP server. Okay, so we're going to be creating this regular expression, and then we're going to be testing whatever the user sends us against this regular expression. If the regular expression is falsy, which means whatever the user sends us does not conform to this pattern, then we're going to know that this email address is for sure not valid. If it does, then we're going to continue to send that over to through the SMTP protocol, right? So what is this regular expression doing? There's basically two parts to it, right? So you can see the @ here, which is the literal @ of any email address. And before it, you have a range of characters that we're trying to test for, right? So we're allowing everything from A to Z, 0 through 9, a period, underscore, and a hyphen. And with this plus sign, we're saying that there can be one or more of these characters, okay? And then after the @, we're testing from A to Z through 0 through 9 with I'm gonna add a hyphen here as well because, we could have a hyphen in the domain name. And then we are going, and again, this can be one or more of these, then the literal period. So this would where we would start the domain name, A to Z, 2 to 3 characters, right? So this regular expression is by no means the best regular expression because it surely doesn't cover all domain types. But again, in this course, we're just interested into how to do a basic regular expression. And here you have an example, and then you can work on your own time to see how would you improve this regular expression. So one way you can improve this one is how would you account for more domain endings, right? Because here we're saying from A to Z, 2 or 3 characters. So this could, for example, cover country domain names, which usually have 2 characters, or for example, .com, .net, which have 3. But what about .co.uk, right? So that has 4 and it has a dot in between. So we're not even including dots here. We're not including 4 characters, right? So how would you improve on this regular expression? Okay, with that out of the way, let's go back to our controller. And so the next piece of code that we want to write is const email format is valid is equal to verify email format, which is the function that we just wrote with the regular expression. We're going to pass in the request body email. And if it's not valid, then we're going to say res status to 400, which is a user error. JSON format, we're going to say error email format is invalid. And we're going to return next again to not evaluate the rest of the code that we're going to be writing here. Okay, so the next service that we have to build is a service that resolves the MX records, right? So that's the first part of the evaluating if email exists, which was we went to that website to see the MX records and see if we found a host name or multiple host names for a SMTP server behind the domain name, okay? So I'm going to create a new TypeScript file and I'm going to call this resolve mxRecords.service. And again, I'm going to export const resolve mxRecords. And this is going to be a async function. Okay, so here we have to say async because we are going to be doing HTTP requests, or not HTTP. We're going to be doing requests to a domain name server to evaluate those MX records. And since we have to do that request, it's going to take an arbitrary amount of time. So this is where we're going to leverage the node async await pattern. Okay. So in here, we're going to accept a domain name. Now to evaluate the MX records, we're going to import from Node.js, and we're going to import the function that's called promises. Now we're going to import promises because we want to use the promise pattern. Okay, so we're going to say const mx records is equal to promises.resolve mx, and the domain is going to be the host name. Okay, and here we just need to remember to say await because this is a promise, so we're going to be awaiting for that promise to resolve. And now the next thing is, whenever we are writing a async await or we're awaiting for something, we always need to remember to wrap this around a try catch block. Okay, so if this gives an error, we're just going to console error this, and we're going to return a empty array. But if it doesn't, we're just going to return, and this is actually going to be redundant because we're just going to return whatever we are awaiting here, right? So we're just going to return await, resolve mx, and this, now it's always a good practice to type the response of any function in TypeScript, because like that down the line, the function that's going to be calling this function, which is our controller, is going to know what to expect, right? So this is going to be a promise, and when we resolve the promise, we are going to be returning a MX record list. Okay, so this is not one, this is going to be a list of MX records, right? And now I can just further simplify this. I'm going to import MX record from there, not from Node.js, not from DNS. And this is basically it. Right, so now we have to implement that there. Okay, so what did we just write? So first of all, we need to split the domain name from the inbox. So we're going to say request body email split by the @ and we're grabbing the domain name, and then we are passing that into the function that we just created here. And then we're going to sort these MX records, right? Because if you remember, we are going to be evaluating them one by one in order of lesser priority to the higher one, right? So this is why we're going to be sorting this list of MX records that we're getting, and this, as we know, gives us a MX record, right? And then, so this MX record has a couple of properties. It has a priority, which we're going to be using to sort by, and then another priority is going to be the exchange priority, right? So if I, for example, if I say sorted records, and I'm going to get the first one dot priority and exchange are the two parameters that we have available to us, and we know this because we've typed this function. We know that it returns a list of MX records which has these two priorities as defined by this import statement that we created here. Okay, so with that done, the next step is to actually code the function that's going to test whether or not the inbox actually exists on an SMTP server. So in order to do that, we're going to create another TypeScript file inside of the service, and we're going to say test inbox on server.service, and we're going to do the same thing, export const test inbox on server is going to be another async function. And here we're going to be accepting two parameters. SMTP host name is going to be of type string, and then the email inbox is also going to be of type string. Right, so here the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to immediately return a promise. Now this is because we will not be able to leverage the promises library inside of Node.net, so instead we're going to have to deal with that ourselves. This is why we're going to return a promise, and we're going to resolve and reject it inside of our function here. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to list all of the commands that, or all of the steps that I'm going to need to automate. And I'm going to just add this into an enum and call it SMTP stage names. In addition, I want to export a type of type test inbox result. And basically, this is what this whole promise is going to be returning, right? It's going to return if we were able to successfully connect to the SMTP host, and also we're going to return if the SMTP host told us that this email inbox exists. Next, I'm going to create the same. I'm going to create a variable called result with the default values of this type. Then I'm going to create a new connection, a new SMTP connection with a host name that we resolved through the MX records by saying const socket is equal to net create connection on port 25 with a host name. And then I'm also going to say that the current stage name is going to be the connection established stage. So the way we interact with the open socket. So open socket is basically a node, a stream of data. We've created an open connection between the SMTP host, and this is an open connection. And in Node, this is represented by a stream where we're going to be receiving information from the server, and we're going to be sending that other pieces of information also back to the server. And so the way we interact with streams and nodes is by way of events. This is why we need to subscribe to different events, right? So a socket has different types of events, such as socket on connect. We also have socket on error, where we're just going to console error something and then reject the promise. And then this is the main one that we're going to be working here, socket on data. So this is whenever we receive new data from the server, we're going to just parse it into a string and we're going to log it. And here we're going to say, we're going to use a switch statement. So that depending on the current stage name, we're going to do and send out different commands. So on the first stage, where we are just checking that the connection is established, we're going to expect a reply code of 220. And again, this is going back to our terminal. This is this code that's here. When we establish connection on port 25, we expect the server to return us a 220 response. So this is what we're going to be expecting. And the next stage name is going to be send hello. And the command is going to be hello mailexample.org, right? And so here we're going to be evaluating if the response doesn't start with the expected reply code, which is 220, then we're going to console error and we're going to socket end, right? So we're going to close the socket and resolve the promise with whatever we have here as we go along, right? So the default value would be connection succeeded false because we were not able to connect to this SMTP server. But if we do, then we're going to update this object and say connection succeeded is equal to true. And then we're going to write to the socket the next command, which is the hello. The next case is then we're going to use a similar structure where the expected reply code is going to be 250, which is this one here. And the next stage name is going to be send mail from, and the command is going to be mail from. And again, if we don't get a response that starts with the expected reply code, we're going to socket end and resolve the promise with whatever we have in this object here. But if we do, then we're going to socket write the next command. The next stage is send mail from. Again, we're expecting a 250. The next stage name is send recipient to, and the command is going to be rcpt2. And we're going to do the same procedure where if it doesn't start with the expected reply code, we're going to socket end and resolve the promise. But if it does, we're going to send in the next command. Finally, in the send recipient stage, if we receive a 250, we know that the inbox exists. Hence, the final command is going to be a quit. So again, if the response doesn't start with what we expect, we can simply socket end, because by this stage, connection succeeded will be true, but inbox exists will still be false, right? So we're just going to resolve it there. But if we do receive a response with 250, then we know that the inbox does exist, and we're going to just socket write the next command, which is quit, and close the connection and resolve the promise with this result, and this result would be connection succeeded true and inbox exists true. Okay, so this function is ready. Now what we have to do is to type up the rest of the controller. So first of all, I'm going to create a default value here, and I'm going to say let SMTP result is of type tTest inbox result, which we are importing from our test inbox on server, and we're going to just create these default values. I'll explain why we need this in just a second. While we go through, this is going to be needed because you cannot really, declare an empty variable in TypeScript, even if you give it a type, because then down the line you may have different problems, right? So we're going to come back to this in just a second, right? So then we're going to initiate a host index. So we're going to be iterating over these host names in order of lesser priority to the higher priority. And we're going to do that simply with a while loop, right? So while host index is less than sorted mxrecords.length, we're going to try to basically say SMTP result is await test inbox on server. So this is the function that we just created, and we're going to pass in the exchange to the SMTP hostname and the email to the inbox, email inbox. And then if the SMTP result didn't connect successfully, we're going to just increment the host index to loop again into this loop and try the next host. Otherwise, we're going to break away from this while loop, right? Because our job will be considered complete, basically, once we have established a successful connection. Otherwise, since this is a try catch, we need to console error this try catch block. And then finally, another thing that we want to test is that sometimes email servers, regardless of what email address you add, they will tell you that it exists, right? So some email servers don't play nice in telling us whether or not an email inbox exists. So the way around this, and this is by the way called a catch-all feature, where basically they just accept all email, they don't bounce the email, but if the email inbox doesn't really exist, they just drop the email internally and they don't even warn you. Okay, so the way around this is we're going to test the same email server for a random email that we create, and we can be absolutely certain that this random email doesn't exist. And if the email server tells us that it does exist, then we know that there's a catch-all, and this tells our user to be, wary about the result that we're sending them, because, the email server is not basically telling us whether it exists or not. It's basically just telling that everything exists, but we know that, certain, random emails will for sure not exist, right? So we're just going to warn the user or our customer that this email server uses what's called a catch-all, and they should be, they can try and send the email, but it may not work, right? So the result is basically not guaranteed when use catch-all is going to be equal to true. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to use the same function that we created here. We're going to pass in the same exchange, but this time we're going to create a random email, right? So we're going to create some 20 random bytes, and we're going to convert that to a hex string and just add the @ sign and the domain name. And like that, we will know if basically the email server is, kind of lying to us, right? And we're going to store this here. By default, use catch-all is going to be false. And finally, we're going to be sending out the response to our customer. We're going to say email format is valid, and then whatever we found out here with a regular expression. Then uses catch-all is this value that we just checked here. And basically, we're going to expand this result, SMTP result that we're getting from here, which is basically going to be connection succeeded and inbox exists, okay? Right, so with that done, let's run this application and see if it works. I'm going to open up my terminal. I'm going to say npm run dev, which is the command for this boilerplate to see if this works. To run a nodemon, which runs this application. So nodemon is always checking for code changes, and if there's a code change, it will automatically refresh. And now what we can do is we can go to Postman and basically just hit send. And we can see that this is working, right? So foobar is an email that exists, whereas Michael at Gmail is an email that doesn't exist, as we saw previously when we were playing around with our console, right? So I hope you learned something about, SMTP servers, how email validation works, a bit about MX records and DNS records, and hopefully this short course was useful for you to learn how to build a very useful API which thousands of different companies use, and you can actually go ahead and improve on this. You can deploy it to any cloud service provider and actually, charge money for this service, right? So again, I hope this was useful. If it was, make sure to, leave a like, click the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.